Hello, DeFiChain gang, and welcome to today's fireside chat. I hope you're all having a great day and reserved some time for an exciting guest tonight. Before we start in today's show, maybe a little bit housekeeping. Leave us a like if you like the show. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, then feel free to do so. Also, click on the bell notification that you not miss any of the further shows. So, that was the boring part. Now, who is our guest tonight? Most of you might know him already. It's Prasanna from the blockchain team of DeFiChain. He's been on endless tech talks and in a couple of other videos already, so I'm really pleased and happy and stoked to have him on the show today and to talk about a lot of stuff. Of course, also about DeFiChain, of course, about also DeFi MetaChain, that stuff, but a lot of personal stuff. I'm really excited to learn more about him. And here he is, Prasanna. Hello. How are you today?
Hi, Lord Mark. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Thank you. Hey, I'm so happy to have you here. You're a busy guy at the moment.
well, doesn't seem like I'm busier than you, but no, thank you so much for inviting me for the show.
Yeah,
It's it, it's
yeah.
pretty amazing, right? So you've been setting up all of these talks, and it's important for the community to sort of know about
Yeah,
you know
hey, thanks.
what it
Thanks
is.
thanks for thanks for the flowers. It's like you and me, we've been talking for quite a while, right? That we should do this. And it was really hard to find a appropriate time because everybody knows Prasanna and his team was working on DeFi MetaChain really heavily. And it was a little bit a stretch. I didn't want to keep you up from the work that you do for the DeFi chain family and for the project, but I also want to have you here that people know a little bit about you. Hey,
Yep. Thank you so much.
cool.
It is like a pretty busy time. It's a lot of exciting stuff that's going on. So
Yeah, I think so. And I think we're gonna talk about these exciting times as well. But I always call it like, let's start like in a job interview. We all know it's not a job interview. But the first question has to be, and I think I know I'm really interested, but I'm sure everybody else out there. I would like to know a little bit about you. I mean, a little bit more than I know already. Especially like, tell us a little bit, where do you come from? You're not from Austria like I am. Everybody knows that already. Where do you come from? Talk a little bit about the background. I think this is super interesting to understand and to put things into perspective and to understand you as a person a bit better.
thank you. So Austria is something that has always been fascinated about.
But you've
But
never been there, right? So far.
no, I've never been there. So I was born and a good chunk of my life lived in India,
Okay.
and part of my family, previous generations, had moved to US, so it's sort of split between India and US.
Ah, okay. I didn't know that. Okay.
And but as I suppose, growing up as an Indian, India has a lot of British influence. So I was, always fascinated about the West. So it's kind of, back and forth, and then trying to learn about the pros and cons of both sides, and then
Mm-hmm.
it's always interesting. And so I was born in a place called Madurai, which is a small town towards the very south of India.
What's
And
the next best, or the next, not the next best, the next biggest town that people might know? But because I've never heard about a place, and India's massive, what's the next largest city?
so that would be the closest would be perhaps Chennai.
Okay, I think
So
people might know that. Yeah, okay.
yeah, Chennai is it's known for some of the Indian temples and whatnot.
Okay.
And it's one of the larger cities in India, but it's more of a city that's rich in culture. And there are things around it, and also India has these things called union territories, which are
Okay.
two. So okay, maybe like walking back.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go a little
Yeah,
bit into detail. I think most people don't know these things.
yeah. So India, since like a majority of India, like, its history is intertwined with British history,
Mm-hmm.
and so most of the government models, everything sort of looks very similar to the British system.
Okay.
And however, as there were a couple of small areas in India,
Mm-hmm.
which after independence, it kind of became where it did not become a part of India. It was still under the influence of the French or the Spanish. So there were these little pots here and there.
Okay.
And if we go to those places now, you can really sort of feel the influence of it. Like things are very
Mm-hmm.
different. So those eventually became, because it was not large enough to be states
Okay.
in the country. So because of that, they became directly under the administration of the president.
Mm.
And so, but going along, these places became this, usually ended up becoming tourist spots, or something that has this foreign culture, which it's sort of assimilated into the local culture. So these are interesting spots. So Pondicherry is one of those that is very close to Chennai. It is more of a tourist spot that people end up coming to. And to kind of name a few, Goa is
Goa is
another.
very famous. I think it's a famous party place.
Yep, and that influence comes from the French. Uh, so
So blame it
it's
on
sort
the
of the
French.
same. Goa and Pondicherry was sort of the same, right? So Pondicherry is called kind of the Goa of the south,
Okay, okay,
and yeah,
okay.
it's so that's kind of maybe perhaps those are the places that people might know about.
Yeah, absolutely, I'm sure.
uh, Yeah. So Madurai is a place which is actually known for temples. There's a major temple there, which is a pretty important tourist spot. And
Okay, okay.
so Indian history is a little bit interesting, right? So you have all of these little kingdoms, and some of these kingdoms ended up building massive architectures. And Madurai is one of those where you have a couple of temples there which are thousands of years old,
Cool.
and things like that. It's pretty common. And but yeah, I was born there, but never really grew up there. Went to another city closer. My parents were they were budding doctors at that point in time, and my grandfather was I think he was the first doctor in a village, and but because of that, he really wanted to stay there, and my
Mm-hmm.
father just wanted to. He did not want to move anywhere else, so
Okay.
he wanted to stay there as well. So I ended up but then educational avenues for me was not much, so they just kind of shoved me to the grandparents, and then I grew up most of my life with my grandparents.
Okay.
So that was so that they're in a place with good schooling and educational avenues and whatnot. And because most of my other family was not here, they were in the U.S. So it's sort of it's been an interesting, I suppose it's been an interesting childhood. Yeah.
Okay, get it. Hey, and so you went to school, and what did you do after school? Did you get into tech all the time, or did you do something completely different?
Yeah, I think so. My family is quite heavily in the healthcare industry.
Yeah.
But I think early on they spotted that I'm not somebody who's going to carry on their legacy in any way, because I was the kid, breaking things all around uh, as I was a kid,
I
just.
don't know if that's good to go in tech if you break stuff all the time, but maybe it puts things into perspective now.
Well, I'm told that I fix things. I like to think that I fix things more than I
Okay.
break things, but
Okay.
breaking is more fun. So
So
I think
you didn't become a doctor, that's for sure now, right?
yeah, I think they kind of accepted that, okay, this kid is not going to, he's going to go into tech, which is, I think I'm immensely grateful for my parents to kind of let me follow my path.
Okay.
Because in India, that is, especially at that point in time, 30, 40 years ago, it is usually people have this bias towards you either go into engineering or you become a doctor.
Ah, okay.
So
Mm-hmm.
people really have this strong bias.
Mm-hmm.
It also had to do with medicine, I think, was always sort of needed in many ways. And then engineering, it was the IT boom that really helped Indian economy grow as it is today.
Okay. We're gonna
Right.
talk about this a little bit later about India and tech, but let's finish your life story first. Okay, so you decided you want to go into tech, and what happened then?
Yeah, so I think so. College, I studied in a place called Manipal, which is a very interesting student town.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, a good chunk of the population of the town is actually, it's sort of a really good mix of people from Europe, people across the world, and
Mm-hmm.
then
Mm-hmm.
India, all parts of India as well. At least at that point in time, it was. I think things must have evolved by now. It was a very interesting place, and to me, I think that was learned a lot about life. But I was also at a point where uh, I think tech and knowledge was getting more and more open,
Mm-hmm.
and especially technology is the place where American universities like MIT and Stanford were opening up their courses, and so it was a very fortunate time to be in many ways. So I enjoyed learning about things from all of those kind of places, and then after a point, I think it was like, okay, I was more entrepreneurial, and then I wanted to follow my passion there. So I towards my final year, I was like, you know what, I'm just going to start focusing on building my company, and then started going on that trajectory.
Okay.
And a little bit later, ended up going into the VC world a little bit, started working with a lot of entrepreneurs. And that was India is a very exciting ground to be in for startups. And that would be a whole another interesting conversation in
Yeah.
itself,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Worked with, had the privilege of working with amazing entrepreneurs. And then eventually after that, I think I wanted to, okay, startups. Startups are a very interesting beast, but it also, you have to, your time is really, really going into all of these. And there was a point where I was, okay, I want a little bit more work-life balance, and then started looking at corporate companies. That took me to Google a little bit, and then Cake now. Cake is, again, I suppose, the startup
Is
DNA
again a
and
startup.
sort of, yeah, startup
Again a
DNA.
beast, another beast.
Yeah. So yeah, Cake is it's a very, very interesting company to be in. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, that's exciting. Hey, you touched a little bit this topic already. You said there was a big tech boom and a lot of people got into, so they became a doctor, engineer. Let's leave the medical doctors aside at the moment. So I saw, or we all see, a lot of the big international tech companies, right? They have now Indian CEOs or Indian CTOs. So there's a lot of influence from Indian people actually in Western companies. And it's like Google, right? And so many others. I always thought, why is it like this? Is this, you think, the reason because this is like everybody's going into tech if they're not becoming a doctor? I mean, India is massive, right? Now we could say so many people, the chances are higher that you get a job outside, but still, I mean, how do you stand out from the crowd? So, what's your take on why so many CEOs, CTOs running Western companies now?
Yeah, I mean, when you have 1.5 billion people, right? So statistically, I suppose it is a part, but I think it really, jokes aside, I think it really has to do with the way that India exposes you to so many different things,
Okay.
where you it, there is a sense of humility that I'd like to think you kind of have to be if you are, because majority of India is suburban areas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, you have the cities which are well developed, but then you're almost always most of the population doesn't live there, even though they may want to go there, right? And there's always this exodus towards the cities that's going to be there from the villages and small towns. But I think that the way of growing up, where you're sort of involved in all of the other things that the culture that has that our ancestors did, and so all of that is still preserved in many ways. So I'd like to think it is part of that, and then part where, because these cosmopolitan cities are very accessible from an Indian point of view, so you still kind of get the best of both worlds if you are somebody who wants it,
Okay.
and it's not very hard to access it. But also at the same time, I think India, in terms of English, India, because of British influence, India adopted English quite early on,
Mm-hmm.
right? And at least, so there's still, it depends on which part of India you're talking about, because I think South has a little bit more English influence, and it's more people end up speaking English. Like even if people cannot speak English, most of the, if you go to the shops in rural areas, they'll be able to manage.
But
You could
you learn English, right? It's like a second language in India, or is it kind of voluntarily?
So it depends on the region, but
Yeah.
most regions they actually are. English
Okay.
is part, and majority of the general schooling is actually English is the medium using which it's taught,
Okay.
and you usually end up taking your native language as the second language. And it does change a little bit in towards northern India, which developed a little bit later, where Hindi is still something that is used as a primary medium. But towards major cosmopolitan cities, South India in particular, pretty much most of it, English would even you can even think about it as the first language in some ways, and then you end up taking again. It depends on where you are, right? So, cosmopolitan cities always English, and then rural areas it might start the other way, but then people will migrate to it.
Okay.
So it's an interesting dynamic, and yeah, now sort of circling back to CEOs and whatnot. It's funny. So Sundar Pichai was Chennai is
Yeah.
that's kind of the
Ah,
say
okay, okay,
that's
okay.
the city that we were talking about, and yeah, Satya Nadella of Microsoft, Manipal University. He did his undergrad there as well. So it's sort of it's interesting to see some of these things, but like what really drives them, I would say, it's at the end of the day, it's up to the individuals, right?
Okay.
But however, it is, it's, I would say the ecosystem sort of gives you the tools in different ways where you're not, more often than not, if you look at these stories, they're not people who had everything, right? So, like, as you mentioned a while
So you
ago,
mean they're very hungry, very eager, very keen to get into a better place in some way?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And that I like to think that the way you sort of your first 20 to 30 years, how you
Mm.
sort of lead your life, kind of crystallizes in some way. It's also now I think it's becoming a scientific phenomenon as well, like what's called as crystallized knowledge, where and then so it's this is really funny article which talks about after 30, if you think you're dumb, you're actually getting dumber. Right? So it was a scientific article,
Oh shit,
and
I'm on a very bad trajectory then with 50, right?
oh, well, yeah, I suppose we all are. But it was interesting. So, the general gist of the article was first 30 years, you're going to be thinking about different patterns and very creative ways to solve problems. But after 30, your brain sort of moves towards what is called crystallized intelligence
Okay.
from the creative intelligence, where now you start seeing patterns,
Okay. That
but
makes
you
sense.
stop being more creative,
Okay.
right? So, which is where I like to think that's what is now called as wisdom in a manner of speaking,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, completely.
So you have more of that, but then less of this. But the question that I would sort of like to we can sort of hypothetically think about is if your first 30 years was sort of towards being creative problem solving, then you might possibly continue that on, right? So anyway, I have no idea why we started down this trajectory, but
We were talking about CEOs and CTOs. I don't know how it took you there, but
oh yes.
interesting.
So perhaps that's a part of it where them growing up, they're forced to navigate certain parts of life in certain ways, which kind of flows through the rest of their life in many ways.
Okay, get it. Hey, and a last question about India. I've never been there, right? So I don't know too much. I always hear it's very loud. It's kind of crowded. So many people, we know that already. Is it difficult to stand out there? Because Austria is a tiny country, 8-9 million people. I think if you are exceptional, I think it's not so difficult to stand out. But if it's so loud and so cramped, how is it there? Is
This
this
is
hard? Is this hard to get seen, to get heard there? Or?
I think it's a very interesting environment in the sense I like to think that it has this duality where so if you look at a city like Chennai,
Yeah.
probably population is between 10 to 12 million, something like that,
Okay,
just in that city.
a little bit bigger than Austria. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But in a much smaller area, much
Yeah.
denser. Uh, but then, if you go look at some of the villages and suburban areas, people actually know each other,
Mm-hmm.
and you have this kind of intimate environment
Yeah.
where it's and especially in these villages, because the way that India has sort of evolved is at some point it was these landlords, and then people around them were very much focused on agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody would stay with the landlords, and then they were happy with as long as they have a place to stay, and then shelter, and then they would help with the harvest and whatnot, and then they would be farming, and then everybody sort of celebrates. And a good chunk of India's festivals would be focusing on some of those harvests and whatnot, right? So that's kind of how some of these areas evolved. So by nature of it, everybody really knows everybody, right? And if you look at those areas, it's like standing out is a whole different thing, because you're already there. Everybody knows who you are in some way. Then you go to cities, like I suppose it's not very different from a place like America, where kind of a similar tone, I would say. Like going to New York, massive
Yeah. Yeah.
population.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's kind of it has at least grown to a place where it's quite similar at the moment.
Okay. Cool. But you left. You left India.
Yes.
You came to Singapore. Now the question is, how is it living in Singapore if you compare it to India? Is it easier here? Is it just different or
It,
harder? Who knows?
I think Singapore is one of the easiest cities to actually live in.
Mm-hmm.
Probably one of, I always like to think Singapore has a construct. If you fit into that construct, it's kind of as good as it can get in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the most efficient cities that you can be in. So I think that's one of the reasons that excited me about Singapore as well. And also the obsessive focus on people, because it's a small country, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're able to do that. In India, it's a very interesting concept. It's a very different dynamic, where it's sort of it's a battleship, right? So you can't just turn a battleship like a bicycle, where you just
Yeah,
pivot.
indeed. Yeah.
So many different pieces moving together, and then it has to be slow change. But then Singapore, it's a very different dynamic, and they've done every aspect of it incredibly well, focus with an obsessive focus on people safety. So I think it's a very different construct, and Singapore is like yeah, it's except for the rising prices that everybody talks about, I think no complaints.
I agree. I agree. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, interesting to hear. So now everybody's gonna say, "What are these two dudes talking about?" This is DeFi chain. Let's take a step back to tech. Um, how did you get in contact with crypto? And have you been like a big crypto enthusiast before you started actually with Cake DeFi chain? Or how did this evolve? What was your take? Always, like yesterday, right? We spoke about Yusin at birthday, and he's in Bitcoin for 13 years. I mean, that's like it feels like a century in crypto. How long are you in crypto? What took you to crypto, and what was your What's the reason behind it?
Yeah. So crypto, being in tech, you kind of follow what's going on.
Okay.
Bitcoin made big news at that point in time, but at that point, that was, I think, towards the final end of my college, something
Mm-hmm.
like that. And I do recall, in my college dorm, trying to mine. In At that point, you don't need GPUs in the computer, and so I started looking into it, and I was very curious and interested. But at that point, I just thought, you know what? Like, what is this? You're making my money out of thin air. That doesn't work,
Yeah.
right? So, like, that doesn't work. And then I tried a little bit, and I'm like, okay, you know what? I'm just gonna give up. I did mine a few, and then now I lost all of it. uh, Looking back, it was a stupid move. But at that point, it was sort of, like, as a kid, I'm looking at this as you can't just mint money out of thin air. And well, 10 years later, now going into a little bit digging into crypto, it's a whole different story, but
Mm-hmm.
we can talk about that a little bit later. But to me, I think that's kind of where I was exposed to it. But beyond that, after that, I was just more focused on the more traditional tech. And about 4 to 5 years, 4 or 5 years ago is when I was looking at Singapore, some of the crypto companies in Singapore, and I was always interested in utilizing blockchains in healthcare. That's
Mm-hmm.
kind of what took me to the crypto world, and because healthcare is a very fragmented industry across the world, and blockchain kind of can naturally fit in into many cases. But I never had a professional experience in blockchain, and that's kind of when I reached out to Yuzen at some point, and then we had a really good discussion. And Yuzen at that point, of course, Yuzen has been throughout. He's seen all phases of crypto, and so I think I still kind of wonder. He took a big risk on me. In a way where I had no crypto experience. I mean, I understood it in some level, and then I was very fascinated by the DeFiChain white paper at that point. They just
Okay.
put that out,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, hey, it's sort of very practical. And then once you start digging in, is where you kind of recognize that you actually start digging into traditional finance, and then my whole perspective changed where I once thought, what is making money out of thin air, that actually turns out it makes a lot more sense
Mm-hmm.
than what we have in many ways. It's kind of it's sad, but at the same time, it's also an exciting time to be in, because like how often does finance get restructured in the world, right? So it's like perhaps once in 100 years,
Mm-hmm.
and we are at that point in time where we have completely new technology which like really did not, the whole capability did not exist before,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, so the way that I kind of look at it is, this is a common explanation that I kind of use is, web 1 was about just decentralizing the way that people can consume content, right? And then, which is basically just the basic web pages, where, because early on it was like you will have to, in order to consume something, you'll have to go to a library or pick
Yeah.
up some centralized newspapers, right? And then web did that, where it actually decentralized that ability, where you don't have to do that anymore. You can sit at your home, or maybe not home, maybe some computer center with the internet or whatnot. And then as things evolved, it decentralized that ability a little bit. And then Web 2 was not just consume content, but now you can actually share content, right? So, and that was brought in the whole era of social media, YouTube, right? So the kind of conversations that we are having right now. So it changed that. That was sort of Web 2. And then Web 3 is that natural evolution that takes that decentralization even further, where you can not only consume and or share content, but now you can actually own something.
Mm.
So, and this concept of ownership is very powerful in the sense, now it essentially it helps you identify yourself in a certain manner, which wasn't possible before, right? This enables so many different things which just wasn't possible before. If you sort of take a step back, the way I would sort of think about it is, uh, it's funny. We had these, some of my friends, we have these conversations about, it's totally hypothetical. But then if you start looking at how governments evolved, right? So today we have this concept of, okay, maybe countries divided into states, divided into municipalities or districts, whatever the subdivisions are called. Though it sort of stemmed from the fact that he needed to dilute that representation in some way, because otherwise you just can't make decisions in any way, right? And there was also no ability to poll everybody, right? It's like 100 years ago, how do you talk to everybody? There's just no way, right?
Mm.
But democracy, that was the idea, that everybody has to be represented in some way, right? And then so we just sort of, the natural way to do it was we kind of distilled all of that into states and whatnot. But if you look at it today, the whole landscape is different. You can actually do that. You can actually get everybody's input using the power of technology that we have. But we've not really rethought or reshaped the world, or some of the traditional models that we have today with this ability, because all of our current way of doing things is still because of the limitations we had 100 years ago. right? So now, if you start thinking about this as a ground, there's so many things that we can do very differently. And so I think that's really what excites me about Web3. And I think that's we are in that very beginning. In a similar manner to AI and all of these, AI has this excitement because suddenly people are exposed to this massive capability. But I think some Web3, the combination of all of these tech, it's going to get us to a new era where all of these are just beginning to shape up.
Okay, so that means you're very, very positive for the space. If you started quite late, right? So we said there are people in the space for 13, 14 years or something like this. Did you ever had the feeling that you missed out?
I suppose that feeling is always going to be there.
Because
I wish I had my Bitcoins
you
and
know
I
why I
would have
ask
them.
you that you get the background here also, because I came into the space 6, 7 years ago, and I had the feeling I was missing out, and I think the people before me had the feeling they were missing out already, because and of course everybody who starts today or a year ago says, oh my god, I missed so much, but you say it's so early, so that's why I ask you, same feeling for you?
Yeah, I suppose it's a matter of it's how you look at it, right?
Mm.
Um, I do wish that I had the Bitcoins that I mined
Yeah, okay,
years ago,
we all wish we bought Bitcoin for
right?
$3, right?
Yeah. But I mean, at the end of the day, like, but it's still, these are foundations for something else, right? So from that, looking at it from that manner, it's like, okay, what's next? Let's work towards that. I think that's the way. If we keep thinking about what we missed out, I think our life is just going to be a long list of
I
things.
I like the take on that question, because I think the biggest problem is when you want to bring, or I don't want to say convince, but when we are in some way all evangelists, right? We are still the early believers, and whenever you talk to somebody, I hear so many times, yeah, but I might be too late, right? It's
Right.
like, and I think it's very important to make people understand that they're not too late. That's why it's very beginning. So don't be scared to touch it. There's still so much coming, right? I think it's
Yeah,
very, very,
definitely.
very powerful. Mm.
Yeah, I think one part is perhaps overall in terms of education about that Web3, because it's 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 a puzzle to a lot of people. But then once they kind of start understanding some of these things, then perhaps things might make more sense. But at the end of the day, finance was still it's still a puzzle to many people, right?
Yeah.
And actually digging in, like, how does all of these things work? If perhaps it wasn't such a big puzzle, more people would have wanted to reshape it.
Yeah. Hey Prasanna, we've been talking about India before, and I want to circle a little bit back, because India is such a massive country. And I remember, so in the last bull run, it was always a big story. India is adopting crypto. Then it was India is banning crypto. Then it was India is regulating crypto. Then it's no, India is stopping mining, whatever. It was always India, 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 right? So it was China and then it was India. So these were the two influencing factors that kept us awake day and night sometimes. Where's India now? What's happening with India? I would like to hear, maybe you have a little bit more insight. And also, what would it mean? Let's do maybe a theoretical gameplay here. What would it mean if India would really jump on that? There's so much manpower, so many people with money also. Let's talk
Yeah,
about that a bit.
that would be a very interesting conversation. Uh, so India, the way that I think about it is India has always been a neutral party in many ways
Okay.
throughout political history, regardless of what kind of decisions are made on a larger world stage. India always tries to navigate it in that neutral manner. That's kind of India's brand in many ways.
Okay.
And I think with crypto, early on, I think they were trying to figure out what that neutral ground is.
Mm-hmm.
And so, India, most of the decisions, if you think about it, because a good chunk of India is suburban,
Mm-hmm.
so the government tries to play a little bit of a parent in many ways. So I think that's kind of where the struggle sort of usually comes from. So you start seeing fraud multiplying, and then you're like, okay, now we have to consider banning it, right? Because of that parent nature that the Indian government tends to play. And then voices against it sort of come up. And then India also, from an economic perspective, right, to promote innovation and whatnot. So it tries to balance all of these factors out. And I think that's where, when it started out, there was no clear regulation of any kind. So I suppose it's similar to how most other countries
Yeah, I
started.
just want to say, like in most countries, right? Everybody's complaining that there's no regulation. Yeah?
Yeah. And India was also going through, in the last 10 to 15 years, India has been going through a massive shift in terms of controlling the money laundering market. Right, so that India went through a very public demonetization a couple of years ago, which was talked about, where in a couple of days, entire currencies were just made invalid.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it was going through all of these phases. I think that made it a little bit more complex because now India had to control. Before that, India didn't have a very good structure on how do you actually make sure the money in the Indian ecosystem is well accounted, because a good chunk of Indian money also comes, or foreign investments as well.
Mm-hmm.
So once they kind of figured out that structure a little bit, up until then it was people who were mining, getting into the mining business and whatnot. It was sort of free money in many ways, right? Then they tried to control that, and in India you had to do it quite fast, otherwise fraud can, because you have 1.5 billion people, right? So it can propagate quite fast. So I think that's kind of where there is this massive drastic shift. I mean, I'm speculating here, right? So I don't know what's really happening, but some of the things that I later on, once I'm talking to more people a little bit later, what I've kind of understood now is India is open to innovation in from that front because they understand the value of blockchains, and even India is, in terms of payments, India is actually very, very ahead of many countries,
Okay. I didn't know that.
because
Mm-hmm.
India was sort of forced to deal with it because now you have 1.5 billion people,
Yeah.
right? Approximately. So then, how do you actually make sure that you have a banking system which can cater to all of them? And throughout the last couple of years, India was also moving digital, and where they really built out some of the foundations here. And it's in India, it's called UPI, which is the Universal Payment Interface.
Mm-hmm.
Where, so they built this out. This is, the central government has a good control over. So, and they're, it's designed in such a way that they can see what's going on, what's coming in, what's going out, and what is kind of the reserved, how it's all managed. Because they built this infrastructure out, they made sure that everybody sits on top of this.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also what Singapore modeled as well. Like, so that's Pay Now in Singapore and then Southeast Asia. And now, I think about 2 months ago, they even connected the two systems. So you can use Singapore's digital economy to connect to Indian digital economy, and transfers are all instant.
Mm,
Right?
yeah.
So
Right. Mm-hmm.
this, if we compare this to the West, or what was considered 20 years ago as the more advanced in terms of tech, which is still in many ways sitting at like T+2 days settlements and whatnot, like this the leap of technology here is in a whole different
Yeah, we
class.
see this all over Asia, right? That these systems are so advanced and give you so much flexibility. Mm.
Yeah, I like to think it kind of came towards, one is necessity, and then two is, of course, like once you have a market that's sort of established, you tend to have larger contracts which kind of hamper innovation in some way. That's becomes a slow moving vehicle, right? So, but then India, when you're later into a game, you do have the luxury of sort of making some leaps. I think that is possibly also what went on. And now Indian government is looking at CBDCs and whatnot as well, right? So, and now that, because they have brought together their digital economy in some way, now they can just take that layer and then shift it to a digital, now blockchains are just another mechanism of digital currency, right? And they can roll that out underneath it. And those are things that they're experimenting on. And from what I kind of understand, it's India has now decided to say, okay, if you want to use digital currencies, feel free to do so, as long as the in and out of the country is sort of well recorded, because that tracing is what they worked very hard for a very long
Mm-hmm.
time. And then once that's there, if you want to do it, I believe the current tax model is anything you do with cryptocurrencies, it's a flat percent, and it's on the higher side.
Ah, okay. So they try
Um,
to make it a little bit less attractive that way.
yes, I think their goal probably is to reduce that fraud. But in a manner of speaking, they also assume, okay, if you hold crypto, like, well, you know what, you are probably making money, which is an unfortunate assumption.
Yeah, sometimes, especially in bear market, it's
Yes,
maybe a
sometimes.
wrong assumption.
Yeah, I've actually heard stories where it affects people in many ways, but it's also not, like Europe. In Europe, it's even worse, right? So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cool. Not everybody is so lucky like in Singapore when it comes to taxation for digital currencies. Hey, Prasanna, super interesting. We learned a lot here today. Let's talk a little bit about your role. So you are, I know you try to play it down, and I know it's a team and everything, but you're leading the blockchain development team in DeFiChain, so in birthday research, more or less, right? Can you talk a little bit about the team? So, whatever you are allowed to talk about or whatever you want to share. But I think because I met your team, you invited me to meet all the fantastic guys who work in your team to bring us the original DeFi chain. Because I think I mentioned this before in a news show when I spoke about we see the product guys a lot, right? They build the wallets, they build the website. This is all what we touch, all the touch points are on the product side. But the blockchain in the background is like the underlying infrastructure that we are not really connecting to because we have the tools in the middle. And that's why nobody knows these people out there. And without these people, without your team, there would be no DeFi chain. Tell us a little bit about this team. I think that's super interesting. They are like the special agents of DeFi chain. Nobody knows them. Nobody met them. I mean, I was surprised, right? You called me and said, Mark, come to the office. The team is there. And I said, who are these people? I've never met anyone. And first of all, they're a lovely team. They're super fun to talk to. There's a great spirit. But yeah, tell us a little bit about these guys.
yeah, it's actually fantastic working with all of these incredible folks across the world. So it is not by design that it's not well known. It would be really fantastic for them to be more known, but I suppose in some ways certain developers and engineers just like to tweak more and then sit behind the scenes. But I think many people would have sort of at least gotten a glimpse of some of them through I believe that was the birthday video for DeFi Chain.
Yeah, yeah, that's where we saw a couple of them. Yeah.
Yeah. So zooming out a little bit, Purdue Research, I think one of our larger missions is, okay, how can we push decentralization
Yeah.
more, right? And on one hand, so you have this blockchain platform which can enable many things, and then on the other hand is this products that's built on top of this,
Right.
and then that's ultimately what users see. And then if there is ways in which we can use the platform to enable more things
Hmm.
and then push that, right? So that's kind of the goal of Buddy Research, where we continue to push that boundaries. And that's also where DeFi Chain comes in, right? So the way that most of our development happens in the open land, and we're trying to encourage that more and more as well. And personally, I'm a big fan of, most of my life, it has always been about open source. And if you talk more about that, that'll be a whole different conversation. But even among the teams here, we try to encourage more and more things to happen in the open land.
Hmm.
And that, I think product teams are the ones who end up putting everything together. And then, they like to go out to the world and then communicate, hey, this is what's all going on.
And that's okay, right? There's nothing wrong
Yeah.
with that. But the light is not so much on the other team. So that's why I want to talk about this a little bit
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. But I mean, at the end of the day, it is like, so that's kind of, the different pieces of everything that's coming
Mm.
together, right? And like every, you take one piece out, it's, again, like since we mentioned a battleship, it's sort of that, right? It's you take some tiny part out of somewhere,
And the
like
whole thing sings, right? Yeah.
yeah. So it's I think in a way where it's just been incredible in the sense it's a very well distributed team across the world.
Where are
So
they? Where, without naming the exact location for security reasons, maybe or whatever. But no, regional. Are they? I know it, but it's maybe better you talk about it a little bit. Where are these folks? All around the world?
yeah, so also at different points, I think as people sort of shift, it's been even more diverse. But primarily all parts of Europe.
Okay.
So there's people from Eastern, Western, Central, and then people in India and people in Southeast Asia, and different points, people from Africa as well.
Okay.
So it's it is I like to think it's well diversified in many ways. The West, US is something that I see a lot of interest in, but then it's not something that we directly work with in buddy research because just operationally it's a little bit of
It's a little bit a
lot.
nightmare, right, with the time
Yeah,
zones and everything. Yeah.
yeah. So it's a lot more difficult. But beyond that, we try to make sure that we kind of hire from all of these places.
Okay, so all your special agents around Europe and Middle East, Southeast Asia, is it by design like this? Did you say, I want somebody from Europe, I want somebody from Asia? Or was it more like you were looking for the best people to hire and it was just happened that they are in these locations? So which way did this end up?
I would like to say it's one, but it's actually not. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it is just the way that the team panned out. It's also at the end of the day, for from our perspective, we are looking for people who are curious about decentralization, and then for that as a larger goal. And then if you're looking for engineers, like who are the best engineers that we can hire. So that's always the manner that we looked at, and it just so happened that we got this good diversity, and it's good to kind of keep that diversity going. Sometimes it's actually
Okay.
more difficult just from an operational perspective, but I think its team is in a good place now. And also now the community as well is also spread around, and there's more and more contributions from the community as well. So like I like to think that we're sort of heading in that right direction where there's more decentralization across.
Yeah, but it's fun, right? Because the most decentralized team is building the decentralized product. So the
Yeah,
blockchain is developed by a team that is really, I think there's nobody, they're not, yeah, there may be two people in the same spot, right? But that's it. The rest
yeah,
is all
yeah.
over the place, right?
I I think it's also I don't think people understand how well decentralized, in a manner of speaking, DeFi chain is. Like we have like what 15,000 masternodes, like somewhere between 10,000 to 15,000 masternodes, right? And then you would go out like see all of this news about hey, like things are very decentralized and we have like 1,000 masternodes.
Yeah, it's
And then
ridiculous, right? Now, a thousand, there are blockchains that say we have about 100 master nodes and we are
yeah,
so decentralized. I mean, talking about Solana, like, I don't know, they might have improved, but I don't know, 1 or 2 years ago, it was like we have like 50 master nodes. Wow, we are so decentralized, right? It was like completely ridiculous. Yeah, that's a good point. We are really super decentralized. It might not everything be perfect on the DeFi chain, but decentralization, I think, is a massive thing that we live here, right?
yeah, that's kind of if we zoom out, that's really what we're trying to go for, right? And that's
Mm.
what all of this is about. Uh, Bitcoin did that decentralization of cash in a manner of speaking. It may not be seen as cash. It may be seen as an asset in a different way. But at the end of the day, that's what it was modeled after. And then now everything else that's built on top of it, or
Mm.
with similar ideas like Ethereum, Solana, all of it is pushing boundaries in like some different way to decentralize more, right? So the way I really like to think of it is like if you look at history of things, technology was an industry that like grew remarkably fast. And I like to think personally it's because of the way that things were actually more open and accessible like throughout all the time. Like so it was uh, things might have been centralized at some point. We could talk about like let's say early on Sun Microsystems or Oracle or IBM, where things were really centralized. But then at the end of the day, like open source ended up winning over, because at the end of the day, like when you provide that in a manner where everybody can consume, and then if it is an actual useful utility, now it's larger mind share that just goes on top of it, right? And it was the same concept for Bitcoin or Ethereum. There was no company that was for profit trying to utilize that for profit, keeping everything closed, right? And I like to think of it as like, if we really spread the horizon to be long enough, it's usually not, it can't just be, one tiny unit, right? It is more often than not that where things go, larger mindshare goes, that continues to
Mm-hmm.
develop faster. And technology evolved the same way. If you look at technology in terms of, Linux and, many other utilities that everybody uses today, more than the closed source options, it is always the open source options that won in a larger span of time. And I find that to be quite interesting. And yeah, that's kind of really what drives this in many ways, right? So it is a decentralization of knowledge and how utilities get built over time, right? So now blockchains and these open source developed blockchains are a natural way of decentralizing even more and more and more, right? So, and I think it's like, in a manner of speaking, I think it's, at the end of the day, it's important for the world that we leave more things open where, people can see things faster, fix things faster. Overall, we kind of improve the utility of it, rather than if things are closed, it's, there's only so much. Even if you have the best team in the world, right, there's only so much that you can do. And perhaps it might happen for a short time span of things, but in a much larger time span of things, right? So I think tech companies kind of in some ways understood that. And that's where more and more companies started contributing to open source, and then, like really relying on open source. And I like to think from our perspective, like we think about things the same way as well.
You said tech companies. You worked for Google and you work for Cake. Oh, you're not working for Cake, you're working for Birthday Research, to be precise. These are two completely different animals, right? One is a massive international conglomerate. I mean, I don't know how many people are working for Google at the moment. Any idea?
Yeah, I think it's probably somewhere in between like 100K to
So,
150.
something like this. So yeah,
Yeah.
and then you've got Birthday Research, what is a little startup, right? Doing a great job, but completely different. Um, Maybe tell me a little bit. What's the biggest difference working for these two companies?
Yeah, so it is like, one is, I
I know
mean,
this is going to be a very politically correct answer, most likely, but still, I think a couple of the viewers maybe out there would be
yeah,
interested. Well, pros and cons. I think where's light, there's shadow, right?
yeah. I think first off, I think it's just like, my life panned out in a very fortunate way that, both of these are companies which
Yeah,
do
both
certain things
exceptional
very well.
companies, right? Yeah.
Yes, both are incredible companies, especially in terms of culture. I think in terms of culture, in many ways, there's a lot of similarities.
Okay.
But zooming out, Google, both are companies that I love incredibly. And Google is a company in a way where, once you become large enough, things change a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that you sort of look at things change as well. Uh, but one, perhaps the most obvious difference would be because of the fact that you've gone through so much, right? So there are emergencies that happen every day, but people
Right.
don't see,
Right.
right?
Right.
So in a startup world, it's often people tend to look at it as, hey, it's a matter of survival in some way,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
right? I suppose this may be one of the larger things that's different, where I, if things break, right, there are large things that's breaking in large companies all
Mm-hmm.
the time. But then you look at it, you're like, okay, all right, okay, what is the next step? And more often than not, it's just a regular part of your day. It's like every day something is breaking.
Do you think that the engineers there just grew a thicker skin, Or is it that these big operations just have great procedures in place to deal with it? Or is it a mix of all of that? Because you mentioned us, right? So let's say DeFiChain, the chain stops or slow, or I don't know, there's a problem with the node software. For us, it's kind of doomsday, right? So it's like, are we all gonna die now, or what's going on? I'm sure in Google, far bigger things go wrong sometimes, right? But they seem to be more, not more casual about it, but they deal differently with it, most likely, right? Or are the people in there just, are we in the community just a little bit too scared sometimes? How would you describe that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting feeling to be on both sides as well. It's funny enough. When I was in one probably example when I was in
Yeah.
Google was the whole of Google Workspace, which is email. Like you could not log in. There was a moment where it happened somewhere during right the beginning of COVID, I think.
Yeah, I think I remember. Yeah, yeah.
Right, so everything sort of went down. Right.
That's a massive
Yeah.
clusterfuck, right? I mean, there are millions of people on the system,
Yeah,
hundreds
and
of
if we
millions.
actually look at the numbers, right? So you're
Yeah,
looking at
yeah,
billions of users
yeah, yeah, yeah.
versus, DeFi chain or, whichever blockchain you take, like it's
Mm,
just, it doesn't match that number, right? So, but then if you look at the way that things are going in,
mm,
yes, like this is a scale which people don't usually it's protected internally. There's so many layers of it
mm,
that
mm.
users, at the end of the day, there are very few users who might see it, or portions of them might see it, right? But like this was one of the larger ones where everybody sees it at the same time. And even there, if you think about it, yes, okay, things are happening, but then there are different teams that are on it. You're going through it in a very structured manner, where it's still in some ways it's a regular part of your day.
Are you getting
Um,
stressed out in situations like this? If something goes wrong on the chain and everybody on Twitter is tweeting their heart out, and like you think like, oh my god, now it's over. How do you yeah, come on. It's like that's an atomic power plant and you're sitting close, you're the closest guy to the buttons, right? And you have to fix that thing, right? So how is this personally for you? I mean,
no, this is a
I
great
was freaking out sometimes when I think the chain was stopping. I mean, I'm just human. Now you have to fix it. How do you feel about it?
well, this is a great, I think, analogy. Like, so let's use the same analogy.
Yeah.
If that's a situation that we had, would you want somebody who is stressed out closer to the
No,
buttons,
no,
or somebody,
you have to keep
who's
your
like,
damned
okay,
cool. You have to keep under control. That's what I mean. Now tell me you stay cool. That's important.
right? So I think that's kind of that's what these larger, that's probably the difference between the larger organizations and the
Mhm.
small startup ones. And it's very valid. And I think these are phases that you kind of have to go through. And large organizations sort of trains you to look at it, okay, all right, things are going wrong. It's okay. Now, let's focus more on, okay, what really happened? How can we fix it? What the next steps are? And from our perspective, I think we've looked at it the same way as well. And in some aspects, I really have to appreciate when you look at these things with Solana. And like Solana, when some of these happened, they actually made a mockery out of it, where there were multiple tweets. I don't remember the exact tweets, but then they kind of mocked the whole thing. And which I think, in a manner of speaking, like, yes, it's time horizon, right? So there's a
Mhm.
point in time where things sort of stalls. But if you it's relative, right? What are you comparing that to? It may feel like for people, okay, this the whole of this finance system in some way, or this asset system in some way that I want to depend on, is going down. But at the same time, if you look at banking industry, and then if you see how many times that things actually go down, it's a whole different scale.
And I think in banks you don't, sometimes it's not so transparent, you know. I don't want to
Yeah,
know what happens in banks behind the scenes. We
yeah,
just feel so, oh, it's so safe because we don't see the shit that happens there, most likely, right? On the
yeah.
blockchain, everybody sees and everybody, hey Prasanna, fix the damn blockchain, you know.
Yeah, that's in some ways that's the exciting part of exciting and more fun part of the job, I suppose. But in other ways, yes, it is
It's
like you
stressful as
begin to
well, right?
yeah, you begin to see that, okay, like how many people care about it in some way, which is also interesting. But this is, again, like, if you really go back at it, like banks, sometimes you might not even know what's,
Yeah,
because of the thing
exactly.
that you might not know, there may be things that are there that never get recognized for a very, very
I'm
long time.
100% sure. Yeah, absolutely. Why should it be different?
Yeah. And
So
this kind of,
you keep cool.
yeah, I think this is sort of interesting where if we apply the same concept in a manner of speaking, we'll have to, the natural conclusion it would sort of have to lead somewhere is, if we look at it as fraud, if we look at it as, what's the amount of money that's being wasted or lost, banks then have to be higher than blockchains, right? If you look at it,
Right.
if you just apply the same logic. And funny enough, it sort of reminds me of this. People see fraud in crypto a lot, right? It's something that's talked about, and then people are very anxious to get into crypto, like talking about fraud. But what is interesting is if we compare it, it's all relative skills. And if we compare it to the actual traditional finance sector, the numbers are very interesting. I think it was a UK based firm at some point. They did this comparison of, okay, what is the amount? So they first looked at just UK. And apparently, the amount of fraud that happens per year in just UK was closer to somewhere around 120 billion, something like that,
Hmm.
right? And then they looked at it the whole world. The amount of fraud per year was somewhere between $2 to $3 trillion, right? And then you see crypto where it's, yes, it's unfortunate that it's happening, but like you see a couple of $1 billion, which is some of the largest, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Like where is billions and then where is trillions, right? And these billions, in a way, yes, we should try and continue to make sure it doesn't happen, and that's the direction that we are heading towards. But then there is this trillions, which is a black box, which people still don't talk about because of the fact that they don't talk about. They don't even know that it's all there.
They don't talk
But if
about
you,
because they don't know about. This
yeah,
is this
exactly.
typical ignorance is bliss story that you don't worry what you don't know, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Hey, Prasanna, we are 1 hour in the chat, but there's a topic that I still wanna touch, maybe as our last topic for today, and we're gonna keep it short because you speak about it a lot already. But I wanna see a little bit the different side of the story. You might know what I want to talk about. I want to talk about DeFi Meta Chain. Uh, you are on regular tech talks. You do fantastic videos where you explain the tech behind it. I would just get like the, let's say, the 3 or 5 minute answer, if that's possible, or a little bit an insight. What do you think is going to be the most interesting or most exciting about DeFi Meta Chain? Because I see out there everybody's waiting for it, but I'm not 100% sure that everybody still understands what it's gonna, how is it look like, how is it gonna be, how is it gonna look like, right? So everybody's like DeFi Meta Chain, like praying to it, but we don't know what's the biggest change for us. Can you maybe paint a little bit of picture that people understand it easier? Also, if they wanna repeat to other people what is DeFi Meta Chain and why is this a game changer, or maybe it's not, right? So how do you see this, and what's the exciting thing about it? I would be super happy to hear your take on that.
sure. One of the things that actually excited me and
Mm-hmm.
even brought me into DeFi chain was, if we go back to the white paper on what
Yeah.
it was about, is it was very practical. It
Yep.
was trying to see, okay, there are certain tech that's out
Yep.
there. How can we utilize them and then provide it in a manner that's actually useful for
Mm-hmm.
people right now
Mm-hmm.
without just hypothesizing on, okay, what it could be,
Yep.
which there
So
are
mean
different,
real utility.
yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of what even brought me into it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would probably be opinionated in thinking through it and with the same lens. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of where we're going. So early on, it was about how can we take the good parts of Bitcoin,
Yeah.
and then, but Bitcoin, it was very hard to build DeFi applications on top of it. And so it was about how can we provide that financial aspects, the foundational blocks of it. And early stages of DeFi chain was really building out those foundations. And now that those foundations are there, now the building blocks are there, but then the connectivity of those blocks, how can you program things
Yeah.
on it, and how can you innovate on it, that was not there. And things like Ethereum has been experimenting on different.
Mm-hmm.
It's a completely different vehicle, right? So now we are like, okay, how can we bring that element and then back to this where we can really make it useful and combine all of these aspects in a manner of speaking? Okay, the world is filled with a different set of tools. How can we use these tools and then provide what's needed in context? I in a Just zooming out even further, like if you see those tools as different chains, right? So how can we take some of the elements of these different chains and then provide this middle layer, which kind of connects all of these people together, and where it becomes this natural gateway for people to work across these decentralized technologies. And I think that's where we are heading, in a manner of speaking. And today, the immediate part that's coming in is EVM, which is going to be this programmability of these blocks. And so, which enables people to innovate on it, which enables people to utilize the good aspects of Bitcoin, the good aspects of Ethereum, and use those existing knowledge. They don't have to, think of in a different chain, like let's say Solana or AVAX, and take anything else out there. You now have to have a different paradigm. But this, you can reuse the exact same paradigm that you know about, that you understand,
Mm-hmm.
and then build your applications with these as gateway. So that's the larger summary of the way that I would see it. But what it really enables is something where, I think it's all about mind share. It's similar to
Mm-hmm.
the open source world where you provide the building blocks, and then using those blocks, people really start to build more and more innovative things on it. And the way that we see DeFi chain is we enable more and more of those, where it helps people build all of these above that in a manner where we continue to push decentralization. And we've always we've sort of taken pieces that is there, and now I think we're getting to the point where we're going to be pushing those boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
where if we look at Polkadot or Cosmos ecosystem as an example, where they envisioned a multi-chain paradigm,
Yeah.
but it is sort of its own galaxy. You
Mm-hmm.
have to go build inside that galaxy,
Yep.
right? But DeFi chain is now about, hey, how can we actually connect all of these galaxies together, right? So in a decentralized manner, so you don't have to rebuild something inside a particular galaxy. And so I think that's kind of the multi-chain strategy that we're taking, as opposed to something like Polkadot or Cosmos. Right. So I think this is going to be a very interesting and a powerful platform for people to build on.
Okay. Cool. Wow. There's gonna be a lot to happen in the near future, I guess. Testnet, mainnet, and then building on the mainnet.
Yeah, and like as with the previous terminologies, it's still, it's just
Still
the
early.
beginning of things.
It's just the
It's
beginning. It's
the
just
very
day
beginning
one.
of things. Yeah.
Cool. Hey, Prasanna, thanks a lot for summing that up. Yo, I really truly enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy day. I send you now back to code the mainnet or whatever you have. No, tomorrow. Tomorrow is a public holiday, but I'm sure you have still some work to do. Hey, mate, it was really great to have you here. Thank you very much. And yeah, I hope to see much more from you. Next week, you are in the Tech Talk with DC. And I think you're going to be a regular on all our channels here anyway. Keep up the good work. Keep us informed. Also, if you are not following Prasanna yet, he's quite active on Twitter. I think you're always keeping the community updated if something goes on there, correct?
I'd like to think so. We'd like to do more of it, but
Cool.
yes,
Yeah,
do our best.
we're gonna link your Twitter account in the show notes so that we make it as easy as possible for you out there to follow Prasanna. Prasanna, having said this, have a great long weekend. Thank you so much again for your time, and yeah, hope to see you in person soon in Singapore again. Have a great day, and bye bye.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time as well.
Thank you. Have a
Good
good
weekend.
one. Bye.